The air in the grand arena was thick with the scent of pine, wet earth, and the suffocating tang of 1,000 wolves in their prime. For the alpha of the Crescent Pack, Leonidas Sirvas, the moonlight was supposed to be a time of celebration, the night he would claim his pack and secure his bloodline. But when his fated mate, a girl with eyes the color of forest moss and a spirit as unbreakable as tempered steel, stepped into the circle, the pack's collective breath hitched. She was Alara Thorn, not a daughter of the highborn, but a servant from the outskirts of the territory, a girl whose hands were calloused from gathering herbs, not from ruling kingdoms. Leonidas looked at her, and the ancient primal pull of the fated bond clawed at his chest, begging him to drop to his knees and worship her. Instead, driven by the icy, calculated pressure of his advisors and the fear of his own shifting, unstable power, he did the unthinkable. He stepped into the center of the ring, his face a mask of brutal, icy indifference, and spoke the words that would change the course of history. I, Leonidas Sirvas, reject the bond. She is nothing to me. A commoner has no place at the side of a king. The silence that followed was a physical blow, heavy enough to crush bones. Alara didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, the rejection settling into her marrow like a jagged piece of glass. Hello to all of you joining us today. We are so thrilled to have you here in our storytelling sanctuary. Whether you're watching from the rain-swept streets of London, the vibrant, sun-drenched squares of Barcelona, or anywhere in between, thank you for stopping by. How is your day going? We hope you're feeling inspired and ready for an epic tale. If you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It truly helps our channel grow and lets us keep crafting these stories for you. Don't forget to drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. We love reading your stories. But back to the arena. The true nightmare was only just beginning. From the shadows of the high balcony, a predator watched with hungry, glowing red eyes. Caspian Vane, the exiled prince of the Shadow Pack, the man who had burned Leonidas's first village to the ground, stepped into the light. He didn't look at the Lycan King. He looked at Alara, who was trembling, her heart clearly splintering in the cold, judgmental spotlight. Caspian descended into the arena, his movement fluid and terrifyingly silent. He stopped directly behind Alara, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back, a possessive, mocking touch. He leaned down, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent arena. If the king does not want the prize, then the enemy will take it. Before the guards could move, before Leonidas could even process the horrific realization of what was happening, Caspian tilted Alara's head aside. His fangs flashed, sharp as obsidian shards, and he sank them into the soft skin of her neck, leaving a burning, glowing violet mark that signaled she was now his. The crowd erupted in terror. Leonidas stood frozen, his eyes widening as he watched his greatest foe claim the woman he had just publicly discarded. The agony of the rejected bond collided with the raw, searing fire of betrayal. How does a man recover when he realizes he has traded his soul for a throne, only to watch the woman he was destined to love be claimed by his greatest enemy? And what happens when the mark of the enemy begins to change the very nature of the girl Leonidas threw away? The arena was a blur of baying wolves and panicked whispers, but for Leonidas Sirvas, the world had narrowed down to a single agonizing focal point, the violet glow bleeding into the skin of his rejected mate. Alara Thorn stood as if paralyzed, her breath catching in a ragged hitch as Caspian Vane withdrew his teeth, his thumb tracing the jagged glowing mark he had just seared into her flesh. Leonidas felt his own wolf, a beast of pride and ancient territorial rage, shriek in the back of his mind. He had discarded her because the High Council demanded a queen of noble blood, because he was terrified that a commoner would make him weak. Now the weakness he feared had been weaponized against him. You have no claim here, Leonidas roared, his voice vibrating with the sheer, unbridled power of an alpha. He stepped forward, his eyes flashing to a predatory, incandescent amber. Release her, Vane. You have violated the treaty of the Blood Moon. This is an act of war. Caspian didn't even blink. He stood behind Alara, his arms wrapped around her with an ease that made Leonidas's blood boil. Caspian was a man of shadow and strategy, a prince of the exiled clans whose only ambition was to see the Crescent Pack turned to ash. He leaned down, whispering something into Alara's ear that made her shudder, not in fear but in a strange, jarring resonance. The king has spoken his will, Caspian sneered, his eyes locking onto Leonitas's. She is not yours, Leonitas. You cast her aside like trash. I simply picked up what the trashman left behind. She is my mark now, and by the ancient laws she belongs to the Shadow Pack. Elara finally looked up, and for the first time, Leonidas saw her eyes. Not the soft forest moss green he remembered, but a swirling volatile mix of pain and a new dark power. She looked at the man who had publicly shattered her heart in front of an entire kingdom, and there was no love left in her gaze. Only a cold, crystalline distance. I am not a prize to be fought over, Elara said, her voice steady, defying the tremors in her limbs. And I am not a servant anymore. As Caspian dragged her toward the dark forest that bordered the arena, Leonidas's seconds moved to intercept, but Caspian's elite guards, the Night Stalkers, emerged from the shadows, blades drawn. The crowd turned into a riot. In the chaos, Leonidas was forced back, blocked by his own panicking advisors, his hands balling into fists that drew blood from his palms. Back in the quiet, desolate chambers of the palace, Leonidas retreated to his private study. He poured a goblet of ale, but his hand shook so violently the metal clattered against the stone table. He was the king, the most powerful Lycan in a century, yet he had never felt so utterly, pathetically powerless. His confidant and head advisor, Silas Vane, no relation to his enemy though often just as dangerous, stepped into the room. Silas was a man of shadows and records, his face etched with the lines of someone who had seen too many kings fall. "You've done it now, Your Majesty," Silas said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You didn't just reject a mate. You created a vacuum in the spiritual order of the pack. You think Caspian wanted her for love? He wants her because she is a vessel. A commoner she may be, but her bloodline dates back to the first shifters. When you rejected her, you stripped her of your protection. And now, Caspian is going to use her to unlock the vault of the first moon." Leonidas felt his heart sink. "I can get her back. I can slaughter every one of them." "You can't," Silas countered, dropping a scroll onto the table. The moment he marked her, he linked her life force to his own through the shadow bound. "If you kill him, she dies. If you hunt them, she suffers. You have shackled your own hands, King." Leonidas paced the room, the scent of Elara's jasmine and earth perfume still lingering faintly on his clothes, mocking him. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a mate. He had lost the only part of himself that was capable of mercy. He was left with only the crown, a heavy, hollow circle of gold. Meanwhile, deep in the dark forests of the north, Elara was not being treated as a prisoner. She was being led into a temple made of black glass, the mark on her neck pulsing in rhythm with the forest itself. She felt a strange, cold strength blooming within her, a power that felt like moonlight filtered through charcoal. She remembered Leonidas's face when he rejected her. The cold, practiced dismissal. The way he had treated her as a footnote. That memory was the only fuel she needed now. "Why me?" she asked, her voice echoing in the cold marble halls of her captor's lair. Caspian turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. Or perhaps, it was merely the most dangerous lie of all. "Because, Elara, you were always meant for something greater than a king who didn't know your value. You weren't rejected because you were unworthy. You were rejected because you were his greatest threat. And now you're going to help me destroy him." Leonidas was alone in his palace, but for the first time in his life he began to realize that the danger wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the broken heart of the woman he had abandoned. The moon was a sliver of silver bone hanging over the darkwood, a place where even the most seasoned hunters feared to tread. Leonidas stood at the edge of the forbidden tree line, his chest heaving, his wolf clawing at the surface of his consciousness. He had defied his advisors, ignored the frantic warnings of his high council, and slipped out of the palace under the cover of a freezing wind-whipped night. He had to see her. He had to know if the mark was truly killing her. As he moved through the underbrush, the scent of her, jasmine and damp earth, was being slowly suffocated by something else, the cloying metallic tang of the shadowbound. Leonidas reached the clearing of the black glass temple, the architecture itself looking like a jagged wound in the earth. He hid in the shadows of a monolithic pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside the temple's inner sanctum he saw her. Elara was sitting on a dais, her posture no longer that of a cowering servant. She held a goblet of dark, pulsating liquid in her hands, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Caspian Vane stood over her, his hands hovering over her shoulders, channeling a flow of shadowy energy into the mark on her neck. "Focus, Ilara," Caspian murmured, his voice smooth as oil. "The bond you had with that fool was a chain. What I am giving you is a key. The Alpha King thinks he is the master of the wilderness. He doesn't know that the wilderness has a heartbeat and you are finally learning how to stop it." Leonidas saw a change that stopped his own heart. As the shadows flowed into her, Ilara's veins began to glow with a violet, pulsating light. She wasn't fighting the influence, she was absorbing it. The inciting incident wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a conversion. Suddenly, Ilara's head snapped toward the pillar where Leonidas was hiding. Her eyes glowed with an unnerving dual-tone light, the mossy green of her humanity and the void black of Caspian's magic. "You can come out, Leonidas," she said, her voice echoing with a resonance that wasn't entirely her own. "The Shadowbound has ears everywhere." Leonidas stepped into the light, his sword drawn, his armor clanking in the heavy silence. "Let her go, Vane. She's not one of you. She is more than me now," Caspian laughed, moving to stand beside her. "By rejecting her you broke the seal on her true heritage. She is the descendant of the forbidden bloodline, the one who can rewrite the laws of the pack. She isn't my prisoner, King. She is my weapon." The central challenge was laid bare. Leonidas hadn't just rejected a mate. He had unleashed an ancient power that, in the wrong hands, could strip him of his alpha status and leave his entire pack vulnerable to the shadows. Caspian signaled to his guards, who melted out of the architecture like ink in water. Leonidas braced himself, ready for a fight to the death, but Ilara held up a hand. "Don't," she whispered. She stood, walking toward Leonidas. Every step she took seemed to drain the color from the grass beneath her feet. She stopped just inches from him, her face a mask of cold porcelain. "You came to see if your rejected mate was still waiting for your crumbs? Look at me, Leonidas. Does this look like a girl who needs a king?" She reached out, her fingers, now tipped with razor-sharp shadow-infused claws, grazing his chest right where his heart beat. "The bond is gone. You killed it with your own words. Now you have to face the ghost you created." She signaled to Caspian, and with a wave of her hand, the temple doors slammed shut, sealing the exit. The floor beneath Leonidas's feet began to glow with the same violet light as her neck. He realized with a jolt of terror that the temple was a trap designed to drain a Lycan of his shifter strength. He was trapped, his powers fading, and the woman he was destined to love was standing before him as his enemy. Leonidas had to make a choice: fight the woman he still felt a tether to, or find a way to break the Shadowbound before she became the very monster he had spent his life fighting. The air inside the temple was thick with the scent of ozone and rotting pine, a suffocating atmosphere that made Leonidas's lungs burn. Every time he tried to shift, the violet glow pulsing in the stone floor sent a jolting, electrical shock through his spine, forcing him back into his human form. He was a king, an alpha of the highest order, and yet here he was, reduced to a trembling mess at the feet of the woman he had cast aside. Caspian Vane stood back, a shark-like grin etched across his face, watching the interplay between the two like a grandmaster at a chessboard. "Go on, Ilara," he whispered. "Show him what his rejection really cost him. Show him the power he was too cowardly to claim." Ilara stepped forward. The shadows seemed to dance at her fingertips, curling around her wrists like living, starving vipers. She didn't strike, though. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze drifting over Leonidas with a chilling, detached curiosity. "You look so small without your crown, Leonidas," she said, her voice devoid of its former warmth. "When you rejected me, you didn't just break a heart. You broke a seal. My blood. It's not just Lycan, is it? You always knew the legends of the Voidwalker bloodline, yet you chose to ignore them to keep your throne pure." Leonidas struggled to his knees, his jaw set. "I didn't know what you were, Ilara. I only knew that if I chose you, the council would tear us both apart. I was trying to save you. You were trying to save yourself." Ilara snapped, and the shockwave from her voice blew the heavy stone doors off their hinges. The tension in the temple escalated as the floor began to vibrate violently. The shadow-bound mark on her neck flared, turning the room into a kaleidoscope of violet and obsidian. Outside, the pack scouts, loyalists who had followed Leonidas, began to clash with the Night Stalkers. The sound of snarling wolves and the clash of steel filled the night air. The conflict was no longer a personal feud. It was becoming a full-scale war. Amidst the chaos, a subtle, confusing variable appeared. Silas Vane, the advisor who had warned Leonidas, slipped into the room. But he wasn't attacking. He was planting metallic geometric spikes into the corners of the temple. Leonidas noticed this, his instincts as a commander overriding his personal turmoil. He realized that Silas wasn't trying to help Caspian, nor was he fully supporting the king. Silas was playing a third game, a game of containment. Leonidas. Silas hissed under the roar of the battle outside. The mark is an anchor. It's pulling the void into our realm, but it can only do that if there is a host of enough raw emotional agony. If you keep fighting her, you're just fueling the portal. You have to reach her, not the monster she's becoming. Leonidas gritted his teeth. He understood. He turned his attention away from the guards, away from Caspian and toward Alara. He began to crawl toward her, ignoring the painful sparks of the violet floor. "Alara, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, honest whisper. "I was a coward. I am a coward. I let the fear of the throne strip me of my humanity. But I never stopped seeing you. Even when I looked away, you were the only thing I saw." Caspian roared, sensing the shift in the air. "Don't listen to him, Alara. He's just another liar in a gold circle." Alara hesitated. The shadows around her flickered, reacting to her internal confusion. For a fleeting second, the green returned to her eyes and the violet light dimmed. But the tension reached a breaking point when a rogue arrow, fired by one of the chaos-maddened soldiers outside, whistled through the opening and struck Alara's shoulder. She gasped, the pain triggering a massive, uncontrolled discharge of void energy. The entire temple began to collapse, the ceiling stones raining down like fire. "Run!" Leonidas shouted, lunging for her. As they collided, the surge of power threw them both through the crumbling wall of the temple and into the freezing river that bisected the dark wood. The rising tension had pushed them both to their limit, and now they were alone in the wild, the enemy closing in and the true, terrifying secret of the Shadowbound still waiting to be revealed. The icy waters of the Darkwood River surged against them, dragging both Leonidas and Alara into the jagged, churning currents. It was a freezing baptism of chaos. As they were swept toward the jagged rocks of the gorge, the mark on Alara's neck flared with a blinding, violent intensity, burning through the frigid water. Leonidas felt the raw, volatile power of the void pressing against his senses. He didn't let go. He fought the current, his powerful shifter-enhanced muscles locked around Alara's waist, dragging her toward the muddy, tangled bank. When they finally collapsed onto the shore, gasping and shivering in the mud, the silence of the woods felt heavier than the battle they had just fled. Alara's eyes were bloodshot, the violet light dimming to a faint, sickly flicker. She wasn't just cold, she was dying. The effort of holding that much dark energy was burning her out from the inside. "Alara," Leonidas breathed, crawling toward her. She pushed him away, her hands trembling. "Don't touch me. You don't know what you're near." But Leonidas didn't care. He grabbed her wrists, pinning them to the mossy earth, and looked into her eyes. He saw the truth, not in her words, but in the residual memories flooding into his mind through the remnants of their broken bond, a psychic fallout of the mark. The midpoint revelation hit him like a physical blow. The Voidwalker bloodline wasn't a curse. It was a mirror. The shadowbound mark Caspian had placed on her was designed to turn her into a hollow conduit for the void. But it only worked because Alara had been feeling so rejected, so abandoned, that she had subconsciously opened her soul to anything that would take away the pain. She wasn't being possessed. She was being used as a structural stabilizer for a tear in the fabric of their world. Caspian wasn't trying to conquer the pack, he was trying to collapse the border between the Shadow Realm and their own. "It's not just about me, is it?" Leonidas whispered, his voice thick with realization. "Caspian is trying to merge the realms. He needs a bridge to hold the door open, and he chose you because he knew you were the only one who felt rejected enough to accept the darkness." Alara's expression shattered. The cold, villainous mask she had worn fell away, replaced by a raw, devastating grief. "I didn't know. I wanted to stop feeling like I didn't belong anywhere." The romantic tension between them shifted in that instant. It wasn't about the pride of the alpha or the resentment of the discarded girl. It was a shared, profound vulnerability. Leonidas leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers. As they connected, the mark on her neck stopped burning. The violet glow flowed into Leonidas, as he unconsciously used his own alpha strength to act as a dam, absorbing the pressure of the void to save her life. "I am the one who made you feel like you didn't belong," Leonidas said, his voice breaking. "I was the one who rejected you. So I will be the one who carries this weight." But just as the revelation solidified, that they were two halves of an essential lock, the brush exploded. Caspian Vane stood there, dripping wet, his sword drawn. He had followed the scent of the void. "A touching reconciliation," Caspian sneered, his eyes gleaming with dark intent. "But you're too late, King. You've already merged your essence with her. Now you're both tied to the gate. When I open it, you won't just witness the end of your pack. You will be the bridge that lets the nightmare in." The stakes were at their absolute peak. Leonidas and Elara were now physically and spiritually linked to a doomsday mechanism. They had to find a way to sever the connection without killing each other, a feat that seemed impossible given the proximity of their enemy. The forest air turned deathly still, the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe. Caspian Vane didn't just stand there. He became the center of a swirling vortex of shadows that stripped the leaves from the trees and turned the river water into thick obsidian sludge. He raised his hand, and the violet light on Elara's neck pulsed with a sickening rhythmic beat, the heartbeat of the opening gate. "You are the bridge, Leonidas," Caspian hissed, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "The blood of the king and the power of the void fused in the body of the rejected. The gate will open and your kingdom will be the first sacrifice." Leonidas felt his strength being drained not by physical force, but by a psychic pull that felt like his very soul was being unspooled. He tried to lunge for Caspian, but an invisible wall of dark energy slammed him back into the mud. He looked at Elara and his heart broke. He was losing the battle. The violet light was consuming her skin, crawling up her throat toward her face, and her eyes were fading into complete hollow blackness. I can't hold it back," Elara sobbed, her voice sounding like glass grinding against stone. "Leonidas, run. If you don't run, it will take you too. I'm already gone." The darkest hour had arrived. The connection between them, which had been their only hope, was now the very thing feeding the gate. Every time Leonidas tried to pull energy away from her to ease her burden, the gate widened, the shadows deepening until they could see the jagged, hellish landscape of the shadow realm waiting on the other side. Caspian stepped closer, his laughter a cold, grating sound. He was waiting for the final collapse, the moment when Elara's spirit would finally shatter under the weight of the rejection she still carried deep inside. "She doesn't hate me, Leonidas," Caspian mocked, gesturing toward the dying girl. "She hates you. And that hate is the strongest tether the void has ever known. Let her let go. Let her become the monster you always treated her as." Leonidas felt the crushing weight of despair. He saw the end of everything he had built. His pack, his legacy, his home, all being dragged into a maw of darkness. He reached out one last time, his hand brushing against Elara's, but his touch felt like iron pressing into soft clay. He was isolated, his alpha power was flickering, and the woman he loved was being erased by the pain of his own making. "I won't let you," Leonidas growled, though his voice was barely a whisper against the roaring void. "If I have to be the one to pay the price, I will." But it was too late for heroics. The ground beneath them split open, a fissure of violet fire tearing through the earth. Elara let out a scream that wasn't human, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that signaled the gate was finally, fully open. The shadows surged upward, wrapping around Leonidas, pulling him into the dark. For the first time in his life, the king of the Crescent Pack was truly helpless, watching as the woman he abandoned was consumed by the very darkness he had forced her to face alone. The descent into the abyss felt like drowning in frozen ink. Leonidas was suspended in a state of absolute sensory deprivation, his alpha power flickering like a candle in a gale. But amidst the suffocating darkness he felt a sudden, sharp and terrifyingly familiar sensation, a tug at the center of his soul. It wasn't the dark, consuming pull of the void. It was the faint, desperate pulse of a heartbeat that belonged to him. It was Elara. Down in the deepest, most jagged corner of the shadow realm, Elara hadn't been consumed. She had been compressed. The sheer weight of the rejection she had carried, The years of being a servant, the agony of the public shaming, the confusion of her heritage, had forced her essence into a singular, impenetrable diamond of defiance. She wasn't fighting the void anymore, she was reclaiming it. "You didn't break me, Leonidas," her voice echoed through the psychic landscape, not as a cry of despair, but as a low, resonant command. "You hardened me." Leonidas gasped, the shadows around him beginning to crack like frozen glass. He reached out into the dark and his hand found hers. The moment their skin met, the void didn't react with violence. It reacted with recognition. The void wasn't an external enemy to be fought. It was the untamed, raw energy of the universe that only acknowledged the authority of those who were willing to be empty enough to hold it. He realized the turning point. The prophecy hadn't been about a king saving a mate. It had been about a king learning to be a mate. He had to stop trying to be the protector and start being the partner. "I am sorry," Leonidas whispered, his voice vibrating with the truth of his soul. "I am sorry I made you walk alone. I am sorry I didn't see the queen who was standing in the shadows all along." As he spoke, the violet light, the mark of the enemy, began to shift. It pulsed once, twice, and then bloomed into a brilliant, blinding white. The energy that had been tearing the gate open began to flow in reverse, drawn back into Alara, who was no longer a vessel for the void but its anchor. Leonidas felt his strength surging back, not as the arrogant power of a ruler, but as the shared rhythmic pulse of two hearts beating in unison. The shadow realm around them, once a jagged hellish expanse, began to smooth out, the obsidian walls receding into the golden dawn-filled landscape of their own world. Caspian Vane, standing at the mouth of the gate, shrieked as the light caught him. His shadow manipulation dissolved, leaving him exposed, small and terrified. He had gambled everything on the idea that human emotions were weaknesses to be exploited, never realizing that once those emotions were reconciled, they became an unstoppable celestial force. "It's not yours to open," Alara said, her eyes now a brilliant, glowing emerald. She flicked her wrist and the dark gate slammed shut with a finality that shook the stars. "And it's certainly not yours to close." They stood amidst the fading smoke of the battlefield, the connection between them no longer a tether of pain, but a bridge of absolute, unbreakable unity. The Lycan King and his mate had returned, not as a master and a servant, but as the true sovereigns of the dark and the dawn. The battlefield was no longer shrouded in the suffocating darkness of the void. It was bathed in the harsh, revealing light of the rising sun. Caspian Vane stood alone amidst the ruins of his temple, his shadow manipulation having completely evaporated. He looked less like a prince of shadows and more like a terrified, cornered animal. "You can't kill me," Caspian hissed, backing away until his heels hit the jagged edge of the temple's foundation. "I am tied to the shadow. If I fall, the remaining dark currents will lash out and consume everything. The pack, the forest, her." Leonidas didn't hesitate. He shifted, not into his usual bipedal battle form, but into a towering primal wolf of pure incandescent light. It was a form the pack had only spoken of in myths, the Aegis Alpha. He didn't move toward Caspian with violence. He moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. "You speak of shadows as if you own them," Leonidas's voice boomed, resonating with the strength of every wolf in his pack. "But you were always just a parasite, Vane. You fed on the cracks I left in her spirit. Those cracks are gone." Alara stepped forward, her hands glowing with a soft, steady white light. She began to weave a pattern in the air, a complex series of geometric movements that mirrored the structure of the void gate they had just closed. She wasn't destroying Caspian. She was stripping him of his connection to the dark currents, isolating him from the very power he had built his life around. "The void is not a weapon," Alara commanded, her voice ringing out across the clearing. "It is a balance. And you, Caspian, have tipped the scales for the last time." She clapped her hands together and a shock wave of pure, neutralizing energy rippled through the clearing. It hit Caspian like a physical wall, tossing him into the air. As he fell, the violet mark on his own skin, which he had used to siphon energy, began to burn, turning from violet to a scorching, searing gold. The darkness he had cultivated for a lifetime was forcibly purged from his soul. Caspian slammed into the ground, a broken, ordinary man. The shadows that had once obeyed his every whim now recoiled from him, leaving him shivering and exposed in the morning light. Leonidas shifted back, standing over his fallen enemy. He looked not at Caspian but at Alara. The reconciliation was complete. The bridge they had formed was now a solid foundation. They hadn't just defeated a foe, they had rewritten the law of their pack. The rejection, the pain, the betrayal, it had all been a crucible that refined them into something stronger than any king or prince. The pack, alerted by the blast, arrived at the perimeter of the Darkwood. They saw their king standing not above his mate but with her. They saw the golden glow that emanated from them both, a sign that the Voidwalker bloodline was no longer a threat, but the guardian of their realm. The climactic resolution wasn't just in the defeat of an enemy, it was in the total public reclamation of the bond Leonidas had once discarded. He took Alara's hand, his gaze firm and unyielding as he turned to his people. The war was over. The shadows had been integrated and the king had finally found his heart. The morning sun hung heavy and golden over the Crescent Pack territory, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land that had so recently been scarred by war. The black glass temple was gone, replaced by a field of wild, blooming lavender, a quiet testament to the nature that had reclaimed the site of their final stand. For the people of the pack, the change was palpable. The air felt cleaner, the oppressive weight of ancient prejudice lifting like mist in the midday heat. Leonidas Servas stood on the highest ridge of the territory, his hand resting firmly on the small of Alara's back. He wasn't wearing his crown, he had left it in the vault, deciding that a leader who didn't know his own heart had no right to lead others. "They're waiting," Alara whispered, her voice carrying a calm strength that had once been buried under years of service. She turned to look at him, her eyes clear, the void-black remnants of the mark now nothing more than a faint, pearlescent shimmer against her skin, a badge of honor rather than a scar. "Let them wait," Leonidas replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I spent too many years rushing to be a king. Today I think I'd rather just be a man." They walked down to the clearing where the pack awaited. There was no grand ceremony, no stiff, formal bowing. Instead there was a quiet, profound respect. Silas Vane, the former advisor, stood at the front, having been tasked with overseeing the restoration of the pack's history. He held an ancient, worn scroll, the records of the Voidwalker bloodline that had been hidden for centuries. "The history is no longer a secret," Silas announced, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "And the bloodline is no longer a burden. It is the legacy of the Crescent Pack." Alara stepped forward. She didn't look like the maid who had been cast aside in the arena, nor did she look like the vengeful goddess of the Shadow Realm. She looked like exactly what she was, the anchor. As she placed her hand on the stone altar, a wave of gentle, iridescent light washed over the assembled wolves. It wasn't a power that coerced or controlled. It was a connection that healed. Every member of the pack felt the shift, a closing of old wounds, a mending of broken loyalties. Leonidas stood beside her, his presence no longer an imposing wall of ego, but a steady foundation. The rejection that had once been their greatest shame was now the foundation of their greatest strength. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true power isn't found in purity or status, but in the willingness to embrace the parts of ourselves we are most afraid to show. "We have a lot of work to do," Alara said, looking at the horizon where the forest met the sky. "The border between the realms is thin, and the pack will need to learn how to walk between the light and the dark." "Then we'll walk it together," Leonidas said, taking her hand. His grip was firm, a promise that would never be broken again. No more secrets, no more shadows. Just us. As the pack cheered, a sound of genuine joy, not the fearful baying of subordinates, the Lycan King and his mate turned away from the throne and toward their future. The cycle of rejection had been shattered. The void had been reconciled. And for the first time in centuries, the wolves of the Crescent Pack were free to be exactly who they were meant to be. They walked off into the golden light, leaving the past behind, ready to build a kingdom that was defined not by its walls, but by the love that held it together.